Welcome to the Business of Hotels podcast, examining the issues mattering most to owners and investors. And now, your hosts, Gary and Glenn.
Gary Isenberg here from the Business of Hotels podcast. I wanted to take a moment and just thank Bo Williams for participating in our last podcast. As you remember, in the opening credits, we spoke about a little story and told a little joke. And Bo Williams from Mission Capital was the brunt of that joke. And he's really been a great sport over the last couple of weeks and great sport, great friend and colleague to our firm as well, to the podcast, a lot of support. And I just want to give a shout out to Bo. Thank you very much for your support. And if any of our clients or our listeners are in need of financing or equity raise, please reach out to Bo Williams with Mission Capital. He's a fantastic broker. He can be reached at bwilliams@missioncap.com, or you can reach him telephonically at 212-925-7708. And again, feel free to reach out to Bo and speak to him about your capital raise and financing needs. Thank you very much, and we're off to a good show.
Hey everybody, Glenn here. Welcome back to the Business of Hotel podcast with the one and only Mr. Gary Isenberg. Gary, my man, how are you, sir?
I am fantastic. How you doing, Glenn? Happy to be here with you today.
You are looking very well rested since our last show at the Hunter Conference. Man, those conference schedules can be exhausting.
They sure can, Glenn. They just drain you. I mean, between the talking, between the going out, and just everything about it. You're just on for like 10, 12 hours straight. It's
right,
crazy.
and I don't think that people in our personal lives understand how difficult it is keeping those energy levels up from start to finish of a conference.
Yeah, it's difficult. And, I think part of it is because we are aging, Glenn.
Right. Don't tell me that.
When we were in our 20s and 30s, I think we could keep up quite well. Problem is we're still trying to keep up with the 20s and 30s.
I know, and I keep having these conversations with people, and I know some of you guys think, what kind of banter is this? But the fact is, this is an issue that all of us men of a certain age, as they say, are facing right now, right? Right. People of a certain age are realizing that they can't be what they were a couple of decades ago, yet we're still holding on to it.
Yeah, well, the reality is there's a lot more behind us than in front of us.
All right, well, all right.
On that note.
One of the things that I noticed about the Hunter Conference was the notable absence of any new brands being introduced, which is a shocker to me because on average, the hotel industry, I believe, has introduced one new brand every hour for the last 5 years, but more like every single month. It's been absolutely crazy in this decade-long upswing. How many new brands were introduced?
Well, I have a question for you. How many brands do we have, Glenn?
I couldn't even begin to tell you. And I think that gets into the definition of even what is a brand.
So we've done some research on this ourselves.
Ooh, really?
And depending on how you define a brand, we took the position of 4 or more properties operating under this same banner, if you would. And there's about 700 brands.
Wow.
Right. And
that's global in the hotel sphere.
That's global in the hotel sphere.
And because it's 4 or more, you're not saying like, Mirage Las Vegas is a brand. That doesn't count.
Correct. So that's what we've come up with in our research. Now, some people are saying there's 1,000 brands, there's 1,100 brands, but the way we define it, about 700. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the big family of brands, they represent about 20% of the total number of brands. So those 4 big families represent almost 20%.
Yeah, I think that makes a whole lot of sense, especially considering the consolidation we've seen and the sheer amount of brands that the big boys are introducing.
Marriott has more brands and letters in the alphabet.
Yes, they have 30 brands, and I believe there's 26
letters.
I actually had to think about that. But not the hotel company with the most brands in the world. There is one that has actually more brands.
Accor does.
Yes. I knew you would know that.
But so what's interesting, though, is how many brands is enough? Or is there enough brands?
Right. I mean, that really is a very big existential question, and I think that the truth lies somewhere in between either side of the argument. I think that both of us can make a strong, cogent argument for not enough brands and too many brands.
But the question, I guess the bigger question, is whether there's enough or not enough, what's generating the growth of brands? Why is it happening?
Well, I think, and I don't want to upset anybody when I say this, but I think the need for more brands is being driven by the company's need to sell more hotels than the actual consumer demand for more brands.
Okay. I think the way I look at it, and I think we're on the same topic to some degree, is one, hotel companies have gone asset light, right?
Right.
So they've moved away from owning real estate and owning more of a brand development company. And in order to continue to grow, and to grow their EBITDA, if you would, and to grow their earnings per share
as
and so
public
forth
companies,
and so on, as a public company, they need to continue to grow the revenue stream.
Right.
So, and I believe that because we're long in the tooth in this cycle, typically a cycle runs 7 years. We're going into our 11th year, I believe, right now into this cycle. So we're seeing a longer cycle, which in turn is saying that the demand for hotel rooms is there. There's still demand, and it's feasible to build hotels. As long as it's feasible to build hotels, the brands are going to introduce their brands.
Absolutely. And I don't want anyone to think I'm assigning any evil or negativity to the fact that these brands are creating more brands. But if you have a particular brand from a particular company on a street corner,
Correct.
and there is a plot of land available across the street, and you have a great relationship with the developer who wants to create more brands, why not sell them a new brand across the street as opposed to allowing an interloper to come in and create something?
So at the end of really what's happening is if that piece of land can support a hotel, and the market can support a hotel, someone's going to build a hotel there. So in order for the brand to be able to capture that revenue stream, they can't if they have a courtyard across the street, they can't put another courtyard because of non-competes. So they got to develop another brand.
And that's why I see that parallel between Hampton and True, because a lot of Hampton folks are building True hotels because they see it as an evolution of where customers are going, where Hilton is going, and where they can be as well as developers.
Correct. So we'll continue to see that fragmentation of the market. The question becomes, what happens in a downturn? That's really the puzzling question, I think.
Well, didn't we on the last episode, I believe, talk about what is even a downturn anymore, right? And is there
a new normal?
Right. You know, and let's get lame and talk about what inning of the doubleheader
the
we
reality
might be, blah, blah, blah.
there will be some economic downturn at some point.
There has to be.
Maybe we go for another 20 years, or maybe not.
It's the immutable law of the universe, right?
You know, if we go another 20 years, we may have like a billion brands.
Right.
So at some point, though, the economy changes and the market has a downturn. So what happens? You know, in the past, historically in our industry, we've driven demand by driving price in a downturn, right? Got very competitive on pricing, thinking that if we lower our prices, we're going to increase occupancy. And, you know, the Four Seasons is competing with the Holiday Inn Express. Maybe I'm being a little absurd, but the prices
really.
are
I remember 2009 pretty darn well, and it wasn't that surprising. I had a buddy who is an executive at one of the major casino strip resorts, right? And they were more moderately priced to begin with, right? So when the luxury properties are selling rooms at $50 a night, what the heck happens to those mid-range properties? They have to drop their prices so far, or else they're just going to lose all the business to, you know, the luxury hotels that are selling for $50 a night.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that what happens now with all these brands,
right?
Well, you know, right now you're sitting and saying, okay, a True is different from a Hampton Inn, as we talked about. There's a different consumer for that. If you have a Hampton right next door to a True, supposedly there's a price point difference. In a downturn economy, where is that?
Well,
what happens?
And I'm still not so sure the consumer even understands that there's a real price point difference when a lot of the major companies, because they have so many brands and they're trying to create what they describe as swim lanes, right? Which I declared the word of the year for 2018. It becomes a matter of, well, this room's $65, but this brand is $68 to $73 or whatever it might be. And that might work well in the development community, but I don't think customers understand that.
You know why they called it swim lanes, right?
I just figured somebody said it and it sounded
because
catchy.
It's fluid.
Right. Oh. I like that. You're in there with those jokes that I never see coming. Like, I think he's serious. I better put on my.
But think about my point though is it's a swim lane, although it's defined. it's really not defined,
Right.
in a way, because it's all water.
Right, it is, but theoretically, you got the little buoys and stuff that that keep the competitors apart from each other. Or when I'm at the LA Fitness trying to swim laps, I'm just hoping that the people that are jazzercising or watercising are not in my lane. Right.
Correct. Well, anyway, enough about swimming. We could be talking we could be swimming all day.
Yes.
But the brand, again, though, looking at this whole proliferation, as many have called it, of brands, is again, my concern is a downturn. What happens? How do we differentiate these brands during a downturn? Do they merge? Do they go away?
Well, they can't if now I've got brand A and they've opened brand B across the street and they're different flavors of the same kind of thing.
Do they consolidate? Does Hampton kind of morph into True?
No, I just don't see that as a physical possibility, because once you get to a certain number of properties, then I don't think it's feasible, practical, or something you could do to the owners of the properties that have to switch.
Well, I mean, there's been many companies that have grown tremendously and then had quality issues later on, and began to defranchise or debrand hotels.
Well,
so
we do see that all the time.
So can't we see that again? Like, so for example, let's say there's a Hampton next door and a True, and we decide that we're going to merge these brands, and now the Hamptons that there's not a True in the market are going to convert to being a True. They're going to put in the same appointments and the wood floor or whatever all the appointments are, right? And then the ones that are in the market that are Hamptons, maybe they get sold off to another brand. I mean, I don't know. Does that brand get sold off or something? Somehow it's got to consolidate. I just don't understand if we have a true downturn, what happens.
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of those things ultimately that we'll see what happens. But I do hear what you're saying. Now, last week I was at a major hotel company conference down in Florida, and this particular brand, it's Radisson. I have nothing that I can't say about these good folks. They said that they've dumped 20%, maybe it was 18% of their entire portfolio in the last year or so because those properties weren't keeping up to snuff.
Correct.
So Vantage Hospitality, prior to their purchase from Red Lion, they may still be doing the same thing. Their former CEO, Roger Blah, said every year they drop to the bottom 10%. So theoretically, it can be done.
To Jack Walsh.
Right? You could right. That's where that came from. Makes a lot of sense because those are the bottom feeders that are holding you back. It makes the entire brand stronger when you get rid of them. So maybe there is a way to do that while converting them to another brand that's in the system, because theoretically, some of the major companies like a Choice or a Wyndham, for example, they go out there with the sales pitch of your hotel has different brands throughout its life cycle. So instead of going to another company, you could go to another brand in our family. So I guess the long way of getting around to that is, yes, it's theoretically feasible to make it happen, but will ownership have the stomach to allow it to happen?
Yeah, who knows? It depends. I think it depends how deep the cycle, the downturn of the cycle is, and so forth, and what happens. But that's the big question for me. So going back to, is there too many brands? Today, I don't think there is, and I think there'll continue to be brands. The question is, in a downward cycle, there will be too many brands. And how we handle that, I have no idea.
All right. So that's not a good place to go to a commercial break, because you just said you had no idea. But we do need to take a break real quick. But when we get back, Gary, I want you to think about this. What about going the other way? Maybe what we need is more brands and lots of them. So hold that thought, and we'll be right back.
Hi, this is Gary Isenberg with LWHA Hospitality Advisors, president of their asset management division, where we bridge the gap between hotel ownership and management. View us at our website at www.lwhospitalityadvisors.com. You can always email me at gary.isenberg@lwhadvisors.com. Feel free to call me as well at 212-300-6684, extension 108. Look forward to speaking to you or receiving your emails.
Gary, with all of these brands that are out there, what is an owner supposed to do?
That's a great question, Glenn. And I think, what we need to look at, since there's so many, so I think we said, 700 brands, you need to kind of narrow the playing field a little bit and understand, what brand to select, right? How do you do that? I think the first thing that we need to look at is feasibility.
Right.
So what I mean by feasibility is if you look at like Star, the way Star classifies hotels, they look at chain scale, right? When we look at you have luxury, you have upper upscale, mid-scale, upper mid-scale, economy, et cetera, right? So with that in mind, that kind of narrows the field, right? So if we look at, for example, upscale, what's an upscale? Courtyard, Garden Inn, AC, things of that nature, right? So the first thing we need to do is look at feasibility. What's feasible? What makes sense? How do we underwrite this property?
Right. So what are the rules for feasibility and how you underwrite it when it comes to selecting a specific brand? Now, of course, we know that your choices are probably going to be somewhat limited because there's already existing brands within that market.
Correct. So the first thing we'd look at is what's in the market today. What brands are there? What brands are representative? Where is the maturity of the market? So we'd underwrite the market and let's say we go to a market that has a lot of select service, okay, but it's a really booming kind of growing market. And let's say most of the brands today are more mid-scale. So you might sit there and say, okay, so maybe upper mid-scale or upscale, maybe Courtyard's the level, or even maybe full service, going to upper upscale, like a full service Marriott. And looking in feasibility, you need to kind of look at a couple of things because there's some markets, for example, that have a rate ceiling, meaning building a full-service hotel.
Right. You're never going to get more than $200 a night or whatever.
Correct.
It might be.
And if you can get that same rate level with an upscale product, why invest the money to develop an upper upscale product and also the ongoing operating costs of an upper upscale? Now, there are some situations where you may want to pierce the ceiling of a market. We'll talk about that in a minute. But so that's some of the things in feasibility that we would look at is where's the market today, what makes sense. And once you kind of hone in on that, if it's upscale or if it's upper mid-scale, then you say what's available in that market segment.
Right.
What brands are available. And with our clients, we obviously look at the big four first. Mm-hmm. We think that the big four give you the most traction, the big two being Hilton and Marriott. Probably the preference, but if they're oversaturated, maybe you'll look at the other two as IHG or Hyatt.
So it seems to me that you're not just thinking of the specific brand, but perhaps the brand mix that's in the neighborhood that comes from each respective company's reservation
Correct.
systems.
Also, as a developer owner and looking to brand, whether you're buying a hotel and going to reposition and rebrand it or you're going to build a new hotel, some of the things also we look at is what's needed for your cap stack. So if key money is important to you and you want the brand to contribute, you might be looking at maybe one of the newer brands because there's going to be more money to chase those deals because they're looking to build distribution and traction.
Right. So they're going to be more generous at the beginning as opposed to a well-established brand that has more than 1,000 units.
Correct. So, but in general, though, our feeling is you want to be with an established family of brands. IHG recently launched a new brand. They're
upper mid-scale all suites brand called Atwell.
Correct. So there's a brand that I don't know what IHG is offering, but I'm sure there's going to probably be incentives in that brand to develop and spur development. So therefore, you might be able to stay with one of the big four and still get incentives as well.
And do the brands themselves, the big major companies, help find the right brand that might work well in a particular location within a market?
That's a very good question. So we did some work a while back for a developer who was looking to develop a hotel in Canada, and in a somewhat second-tier city in Canada, and they wanted to build a luxury hotel. They wanted to build like a W, for example. And they went to Starwood, and this was back before the Marriott days, and went to Starwood, and Starwood said, this isn't the market for that, and pushed them down to a lower scale brand. So they will help with that.
That's surprising that they would push you down because that might signal less profitability for the
You don't want to
company.
take, but at the same point, they've got to look for brand integrity,
right?
So they don't want to put a brand that like a W in a market that's not going to work. They're not going to take it and put it in the middle of suburban USA because it's not the right market for it, and it really kind of diminishes the brand value.
Right. All right. All of that makes sense to me. So with so many brands that are out there, what if you choose not to go with the main four? How do you go through the process to find the right brand that fits your budget, your personality, and your expectations?
So obviously your capital stack and how much contribution they're going to give you. I think also, what's their distribution, what's their growth plan, what's in their pipeline, where have they been successful with this brand before, and understanding that. There's a lot, and also understanding how it's going to be operated. Some of these smaller type brands, for example, Dream, and then they're unscripted. They don't franchise; they're managed. So if you're looking to enter into a franchise agreement and manage yourself or something, you're not going to. It kind of takes out a whole set of brands, and that's not going to work for you.
Well, that's a great point that I didn't really think about. That there are some brands that are exclusively there to do management of your properties. They don't allow you to run it yourself.
Correct. W is another one, for example.
Right.
Within at least it was
I didn't
with
realize
Starwood.
that was about W.
Yeah,
but like Four Seasons is definitely like
correct.
that. Yeah.
St. Regis brand, I don't think can franchise. I mean, there's certain brands, JW, I don't think you can franchise. So there are some brands that have to be brand managed.
Is there any rules on how that works, or is it just each brand kind of has its own point of view with the way they want to be represented and operated?
I think it's their own way they want to be represented. They want to keep a certain level of quality and consistency within that brand. Some of those more luxury, higher-end type brands
Right.
are also smaller in the sense, not the property itself, but the numbers that they are and the locations they will go into.
Mm-hmm. All right, so all of this sounds like stuff that's right up your alley. Exactly the stuff that you do every single day.
Yeah, we do. And,
Right?
and I think that's the key is that, a firm like ours or someone else's to help you identify feasibility, what makes sense. The other side of feasibility that's important to look at is what restrictions do you have from a development standpoint in regards to how big the lot, the building can be from a zoning perspective.
Right.
So if you can build a 100,000 square foot building and to do a select service, maybe you only need 80. To do a full service, you could do a full service there, but at the same point, what's required? Like, if you're going to do banquet space, then it expands how much parking you have. So, for example, like in the boroughs of New York City, like out in Queens and so forth, if you build a hotel, I think you need something from a parking code, something like 1 parking space per 10 rooms of the hotel. But if you do banquet space, you need like 1 parking space per seat.
Right.
So it becomes much more expansive, and therefore it could really hurt your costs, because if you don't have the facilities for a big parking lot, you may have to build a parking structure.
So that's a great tip right there. So what might seem like a better opportunity, I'll build all of this space and create a meetings business, that might actually be counterintuitive to the actual cost to get in and your potential for profitability
Correct.
long term.
So it's really understanding, again, going back to the market, the feasibility of the market. What can the market handle? There's some markets where, a full service might make sense. And I look at like the Courtyards of the world, or the Hilton Garden Inns of the world, or the Hyatt Places of the world that are somewhat kind of like mini full service hotels. They kind of take the place of a full service Marriott or full service Hilton in those developing markets. And to build a full service Hilton or Marriott in those markets, you're going to have a rate ceiling. The market might not be mature enough to allow you to get a higher rate for a full service hotel. That's why it would make sense to do a Courtyard. On the other hand, though, if the market is on fire and you expect a lot of growth, IBM's moving in next door, and you expect this to be a very mature market in a couple of years,
right,
you may want to take the risk and invest and do a full service hotel, because you wouldn't want to build a Courtyard or a Garden Inn, and then 2 years from now, someone comes in with a full-service Hilton or Marriott over you and kind of pushes you down.
Ooh, that's something that you may not be anticipating on the onset of your project.
Correct. So you need to kind of understand where the market's heading. So it's a little bit of some crystal ball and some prediction. But when we do feasibility and market studies, we look at a lot of data. We look at what's in the pipeline, what's planned, what kind of hotels, what people are looking at, availability of land, barriers to entry, all those types of things which come into play.
Now, it seems that sometimes there are markets that have been around forever but seem to be recently discovered by the entire universe. And I say that particularly about Nashville, which right now, according to Lodging Econometrics and our friend Bruce Ford over there, they have a higher percentage of rooms going in than any other market, compared to existing hotels in any other
They may have more
market.
rooms in development than they're actually occupied or in service today.
Okay, so is that still a good market to go into, or do you have to really start to get down to with a lot of yes buts?
Well, I think that's an interesting market. Because I think the city of Nashville in Tennessee is doing a lot of incentives to get companies. A lot of companies moving down to great quality of life. It's not just the Western music capital of the
Right.
world. There's got a lot more than what it had. So I think there's still some great drivers of demand and growth down there that make sense. But I think as markets become mature, you got to be careful. And it's always, hey, it's real estate. What's the number one rule in real estate? Location, location, and location.
Right.
Same thing with developing a hotel.
Is there any markets that you're particularly excited about right now?
I think what we're seeing in general is the kind of second tier cities, such as a Nashville, such as a Charleston, a Charlotte, and all these kind of markets are starting to become much more major players of markets.
Right, and like Charlotte in particular, which is such a huge banking city, for example, it's really hotel development isn't just being driven by a good economy in the hotel industry and an availability of certain brands, but they're expanding markets with potential for more guests.
And they're also these types of markets are feeding off of other successful cities in the region, like Tacoma, Washington.
Right.
Seattle's expanding and growing so much that's pushing out, and that's becoming a player in that region. So there's lots of that kind of stuff that you got to evaluate. But to bring it back to what we were talking about the brand proliferation.
Yes, I love
and
it.
So
Let's put a
forth.
nice little bow on this whole conversation.
And bringing it back to that, once you understand what's possible, what's feasible, both from a zoning perspective and from the underwriting and what can be profitable, then if you say, I'm going to build an upscale hotel, now you sit there and say, okay, here's the pool of the 700 brands that are out there, there's 100 upscale, for example.
Right.
Now, how do I narrow it down? And the first thing you look at is what's in the market. Who's in the market, who's saturated, who's not. Or there's so much Marriott product, does it make sense that even more Marriott product makes sense? You got to kind of understand that.
That's where the whole thing is. I kind of mentioned it a little bit at this part of our conversation. There is here, like, for example, in Las Vegas, you have the cluster effect, right? The more properties there are, the better everyone seems to do. So can you take that logic and apply it to Hilton family of brands,
I think
Marriott
you can.
family of brands?
So if you're sitting there and you're looking at a market and it's saturated with Hilton product and saturated with Marriott product, and maybe IHG is somewhat representative, Hyatt's somewhat representative, where do you want to be? Let's face it, Marriott and I think Hilton's there too. They're both kind of brands, build it, they will come.
Right.
And I think in general statement is that's where we would lean to, is those two families first. But in a market that there's a lot of growth and development happening and a lot of demand drivers moving in the market, oversaturating those brands might make sense.
Is there a rule for the percent of reservations that are delivered through the branding company that you tend to follow, or is it just kind of really variable?
It depends on how you define that.
Right.
And a lot of brands include in their statistics GDS as well, because the GDS, even though it comes through the GDS system, it books through the brand's reservation system. So the general, it's about 40% brand, but that includes usually GDS.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Any final thoughts on this particular topic?
Again, I think you really need to understand the market. You need to understand what's feasible from an underwriting standpoint and from the zoning and code perspective. If you got to look at parking requirements and things of that nature, and understanding the dynamics of the future of the market. Where's the market headed?
Right. And I'm going to guess, you tell me if I'm wrong, but other things to consider are maybe those local market incentives for if you do something sustainable or if you're in a business improvement district.
Correct. Opportunity zones from a development standpoint
Right.
are huge right now, right? Where you get all these kind of tax deferrals and tax incentives. I know there's some really significant tax advantages right now to develop, like in Puerto Rico. There's huge opportunity zones there, and there's businesses out there that are actually going to those markets and putting together business plans to obtain those tax credits, if you would, and then sell them.
Right.
It's a whole different. It's something I can't comment on.
Right.
It's way above my pay grade, but it's interesting.
All right, so last question that I have for you, Gary. I know I'm peppering you with questions as
That's
opposed to
great.
us having a little bit of a discussion, but this is such an interesting issue to me that I don't really necessarily know a
You find
lot
something
about.
interesting?
Yeah, well, I find almost everything interesting. I'm a sucker with that. Dang, now I forgot where I was going with this
See how
great
that happens?
point. It does definitely happen. We're getting a little, senioritis happening here. Not the type when you're a senior in high school, but when you get older. But let me see if I could wrap this all up. Oh, yeah. How long does it take on average for a feasibility study to be conducted?
So from an underwriting feasibility market study, you're looking at, it can be done in 2 weeks. It can be done in 30 days.
Right.
Obviously, the shorter the period, the more you're going to be charged for it because, more time is going to be dedicated to it.
Yeah.
And some are more simple than others. Some are just a numbers exercise, and some you really need to kind of dive in and really understand the market. We're working on an assignment right now in a very interesting, I can't get into too much detail, but it's a suburban location, and it was an old, huge corporate park. Part of the old Bell Labs kind of situation of the AT&Ts
Right.
and all this. And they've put in a conference center, and they're looking to build a hotel with meeting space and so forth. And it's interesting because it's in the middle of nowhere. So
Right.
So you have to kind of really understand, where's the business going to come from? Is it are you creating a destination, or are you going to be taking demand from other markets? So you really have to kind of understand that. And there's a lot of that happening right now. There's a lot of reuse of real estate happening out in our country today.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And I love the idea of taking these old school corporate campuses and reinventing them for the modern age.
Correct, and that's what's happening all across the country.
Great. Any final thoughts before we tell us how to find you?
Final thoughts. I think, hey, I enjoy hanging out with you and
Yeah,
doing
man,
all
it's
this
a lot of
banter
fun.
back. But not a lot of banter today, so we got to work on that.
No, I think the first half of the show, there was plenty of banter, but the second half, you're just so full of insight, I just had to go into interview mode instead of conversation mode.
Which is great. And
Yeah.
you can always find me on our website at LWHospitalityadvisors.com, or you can reach me an email at gary.isenberg@lwhadvisors.com. I got it right,
I know.
Glenn. Imagine that.
I was just about to compliment you on that. Usually a little behind the scenes stuff. We have to hit stop on the recording about 47 times before he gets that.
Whoever thought to change our email address from our website, but whatever.
I know. Whatever. That's great. Thank you, Gary, for being here. So for Gary and myself, Glenn, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time in the Business of Hotels.
Thank you, everyone.